Okay. We just completed chapter two. And if you remember, chapter two basically dealt with the southern colonies, Virginia first, where Jamestown was located. And then we got into Maryland, settled by the Catholics. And then we talked about the Carolinas. Originally, it was stretched all the way from where currently North Carolina is all the way down to Florida. And then they separated in 1712 into North Carolina and South Carolina. And then along came Georgia, which was the last of the 13 colonies to be settled. And Georgia became a buffer to protect the valuable Carolinas. So, yeah, we discussed those southern colonies and we talked about what they all had in common. They all used free labor, whether it's indentured servants. And then in 1700, it became slaves that were used. Um, and we talked about the fact that each one of those southern colonies had some kind of cash crop, mostly tobacco, but then some had rice, some had sugar, but most tobacco was the one that brought about the most profit. And then they all, generally speaking, had close ties with England because they traded. The slow moving meandering rivers allowed for trade, lucrative trade between the colonies and the mother country. So there's a lot of loyalists there. People are loyal to the British Crown. On the flip side, now we're going to be talking in chapter three about the northern colonies, completely opposite in almost every way possible. The northern colonies were settled for religious reasons as opposed to for money, like you did in the southern colonies. The northern colonies were the people there are very religious. They were trying to get away from England. Almost everybody came for religious reasons, and the climate was different. The people that settled were different. They're going to definitely develop differently, and they're going to have virtually no ties with England, and there's going to be an animosity or a hatred directed at the mother country. So yeah, let's jump right into the settling of the northern colonies. And you can't talk about the settling of the northern colonies without talking about religion, because that's why, as I said, they were settled. This whole, back to the Protestant um, Reformation and the fact that England, because of Henry VIII, wanted to break away from the Catholic Church, wanted to totally get rid of all Catholics in England. They went from being a Catholic country to being a Protestant country, mainly because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wives, and the Catholic Church wouldn't allow him to divorce his wife. So I figured, what the heck? I'll create my own religion, and I'll put the king, myself, as he said, in charge of the Protestant church known as the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and that's how that Protestant Reformation came about in England. But in 1517, before that, it was Martin Luther who nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral, igniting this Protestant Reformation in Europe. It was 95 arguments against the Catholic Church. And then a lot of countries were going Protestant, and then England jumped right into it. And it was very convenient for Henry VIII because of his whole stance on the Catholic Church. So there's October 31st, 1517. There's a sketch right there of Martin Luther. And you could see in this map right here, you have the pink states being those states that claim to be Protestant, and then the yellow claiming to be Catholic. So you see that, you could look at the dates there in the early to mid 1500s. Many countries were going Protestant, and it was 1534 when England went Protestant. Now let's talk about these two terms right here, Puritans and separatists. Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England or the Anglican Church, and separatists wanted to break away from the Church of England. Puritans were unhappy with the snail-like pace of the and progress of the Protestant Reformation and wanted a strict Protestant environment in the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church, by its very nature, wasn't that strict. We know that the main reason that they became Protestant was because the king wanted to get a divorce. So their religion isn't based on religious fervor or strictness. There's a culture of looseness, I guess you could say, in their religion that the Puritans didn't like. There were other Protestant churches throughout Europe that were very strict and believed in what's called predestination, and the belief that it was predetermined before you were born whether you were going to heaven or hell. And you never really knew whether you were going to heaven or hell unless maybe God had come to you in a vision or a dream and told you you're what they called a visible saint, meaning that you would be admitted to the church. There were some countries that were very strict like that. England was not. The Puritans, who are English, wanted and pleaded for the Anglican Church to become more strict. That was their desire. On the other hand, you have separatists who were so frustrated or just didn't like the way the church was, so they wanted to separate. The most well-known separatist group in history, and we're going to be studying them here in a few minutes, would be the Pilgrims. To go on a pilgrimage is to leave, go away. This chart right here will show you the difference between Puritans and Pilgrims. So I'll read this to you here. It says the Puritans on the left, it felt it had kept too much of the Catholic rituals and traditions and wanted to purify it, hence Puritans, by eliminating all traces of Catholicism. On the other hand, looking at the other side, the Pilgrims, their belief was they did not think reform was even possible. They desired a complete separation from the church. The word pilgrim often refers to a spiritual wanderer. And then on the bottom here, both were persecuted by the monarchy. You either do things the way that the Anglicans wanted, or you weren't welcome there. So the Puritans populated to New England, and we'll be talking about them later on too. And then the Pilgrims fled to Holland first, and then eventually to Plymouth, Massachusetts, as we know them as the Pilgrims. So let's talk about the Pilgrims. Let's get right into it. We know Pilgrims a lot because of, maybe when you're in kindergarten, you have those who are Pilgrims and those who are Native Americans, and they, the turkey and Thanksgiving and all that. And let's talk about who they were really. Let's talk about the basics of who the Pilgrims were. So first off, a separatist group that originally asked the king if they can go to the Netherlands, because in the Netherlands, it was the only area that they allowed freedom of religion. So they wanted to worship as they pleased. The Netherlands, they would allow that. The problem with this group that went to the Netherlands is their kids were coming back home and they were speaking Dutch, and the Pilgrims didn't like that. They were loyal British subjects, and they wanted their kids speaking English and being loyal British subjects as well. So they left the Netherlands, came back to England, and pleaded with the king to allow them to settle in the New World. There was already a settlement in the New World, as you know. In 1607, Jamestown was settled by the Virginia Company, and they asked if they could go join the crew at Jamestown, and the king allowed it. And that's the thing that's unique about England compared to other countries like France. They allowed their dissenters, their religious dissenters, to leave, to get on a ship and leave. They'd rather have them leave than, worship, do their own thing in England and go against what the beliefs were of their own church. So they'd rather get rid of them instead of putting them in jail or killing them, like France did. They would say, leave, go. So 103 pilgrims left left England, left Plymouth, England, and they went on a voyage that took them 65 days on the ship, as we know, as the Mayflower. I'm sure you all have heard of that. They arrived in 1620. And 102 arrived, 103 started, one died on the way over. I'm not sure how. However, the Mayflower was bound for Jamestown, Virginia. It got blown off course by a storm, and they ended up north of their target in a place called, what's going to be called, Plymouth, Massachusetts. So interestingly enough, the Pilgrims started in Plymouth, England, and arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts. And incidentally, it was already named that by John Smith, who explored up in that territory. And when he got to this area, said, wow, this really reminds me of Plymouth, England. And that's why he named it Plymouth. So the Pilgrims arrived there, and they were very eager to get off the ship. However, they knew that the area that they landed was unincorporated, meaning there was no government structure in place. So the leaders of the Pilgrims made everybody sign what becomes known as the Mayflower Compact. And all it was a drawing up of how they were going to run their colony, and it was going to be based on democracy, and leaders were going to be voted on every year. So we look at it as a sacred document because it's the first really written down democracy in North America. So the Mayflower Compact's a sacred document for us in this country. So moving on. Here's a picture of what the Mayflower looked like. In the last slide, it says it's about this, the top of it's about the size of a tennis court. So it's not huge. You had to have 103 people on board that. So it was very crowded, and they were really eager to get off at the time. But they made them sign that Mayflower Compact first. So here is the Mayflower Compact, or what it said. And here they are, the sketch here, signing the Mayflower Compact. William Bradford became their first leader. He's a governor of the Plymouth Colony, and they continually elected him again and again. It was a really, really rough start for the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims believed that the weather was going to be warmer, so they didn't have the clothes necessary. And the first winter there, they starved to death. So they died of exposure. They died of starvation. They really, really struggled. So 44 of the 102 survived that first winter. So it was really rough. 1621 comes along, and they're able to plant crops, and they got some help also from anyway, let me talk about this first. They got some help from a Native American by the name of Squanto, who I'll talk about in a second. A little funny there. Thanksgiving Pilgrims. It says here, Native Americans. It said, did the Pilgrims get any good deals the next day on the first Black Friday? So a little bit of Thanksgiving humor. There's Squanto right there. Squanto was a Native American who was all by himself. He was, and this is lucky for the Pilgrims, he might have been, probably was, the only Native American in the Western Hemisphere that knew English. He didn't know it well, but he knew it enough to get by. And the reason he knew English is because he was captured at one point by the Jamestown settlers, and he was brought back to England, where he lived there as basically a slave for a while, and escaped and ended up finding a passage back to his homeland. Never found his family, but was able to hook up with the Pilgrims, who were a very peaceful people. They weren't out to fight with the Native Americans like we talked about with the Jamestown settlers that were just so land hungry. Now remember, the Pilgrims are there for religious reasons and has nothing to do with tobacco, or like the Jamestown originally, it was gold. So they're not there to challenge the Indians. And in fact, they had a pretty productive relationship with the local natives. And Squanto was the one who taught them how to fertilize crops, how to grow crops in a more hostile environment. And I say hostile environment because it's much colder in Massachusetts, and you have to plant at the right times, and you can never count on like a big bounty of crops because the soil is just not fertile enough. But he taught them how to get by. Did they have a Thanksgiving? Something like that, something similar to a Thanksgiving, where Native Americans got together and ate together, but it's more symbolic than anything. Okay, so the next group we're going to talk about is Massachusetts Bay Puritans, another group that landed about 90 miles north in what is today Boston, and they are Puritans. They are very, very, very strict. They wanted to leave England because they were frustrated at how loose the government was. As I said, Puritans wanted to purify the Anglican Church, and they wanted to make it as strict as they possibly could. And they could not stand the thought of having to go to church with people who were not saved. And I'm putting air quotes by that, saved, because to be saved means that that God predetermined whether you're going to heaven or hell. He said, you're going to heaven. You'd be a visible saint. Now, the question always comes up as to how did they know if you were a visible saint? And you would have to go in front of a board, believe it or not, a church board, where that you would tell your story about how God came down to you and in a dream and told you that you were the saved. And they would rule on it and say, no, that didn't happen, or yes, that did happen. And if they determined that it did happen, thereby you would be called a visible saint and you would be eligible to go to church. That only happened in the strictest Protestant countries in Europe. And the Puritans wanted England to go that route. England didn't want to limit the number of people going to church, because when people came to church, they brought their money too. So they wanted people to pay to the church and give money. And if you limit the number of people that go, you're going to limit the amount of money that you can get. So England wanted everybody to go to church. The Puritans wanted only the visible saints to go to church. And they hated the fact that they were sharing pews with someone who wasn't, air quotes, saved. The Massachusetts Bay Puritans were able to acquire a charter from the king. They wanted to leave. He said, yes, go. They got permission to settle. 11,000 people eventually came to Massachusetts Bay. They got on a ship. They were led by a man by the name of John Winthrop. John Winthrop gave them a speech before they left, and he said, I want us, the Puritans, to be an example to the rest of the world of how you colonize. He wanted them to be a city upon a hill that everybody could look up and see. He called it a beacon light that shows the world how you colonize. It says here, the natives are all dying of smallpox. The Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess. There's a quote from John Winthrop. Kind of gives you his idea of what he believed, like with the Native Americans. Now, the Pilgrims that landed in 1620 got along well with the Native Americans. The Massachusetts Bay Puritans, 90 miles north, their philosophy was, hey, let's clear the land, get rid of the Indians, and it's our land, our territory. So yeah, that was their philosophy. They wanted. Here's a sketch of him giving a speech right before they left. It says here, we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, and that the eyes of the people are upon us. So they had a mission to do colonization right, I guess you could say. They specialized, meaning there were people who got on the boat who were builders, who could build shelter. There were hunters. There were miners, people who could mine for gold if it was potentially there. And there were farmers. And you did your own thing. And you did it for the good of society. It's a little bit better plan than, say, the Jamestown settlers that were just mining for gold. So they were ready. They were organized. They were strict. And they had a tremendous work ethic, and they were very, 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 very religious. No, not the only ones who could get on that ship that weren't saved would be your children. So you had to have mom saved, dad saved, and then if they had a child, that child could get on board. So families came over, but almost everybody had to be saved to get on that boat. So let's talk about what life was like in Massachusetts Bay near Boston. What they did for a living is they were fur traders, they were fishermen, and they were shipbuilders. Whaling also. They had to do with what they had, right? They didn't have fertile soil. They did grow crops, but the crops that they grew were subsistence, meaning the subsistence farms are you grow what you eat what you grow. Families were large. Upwards of 10 to 15 kids per family. You had to feed everyone, so you grew enough food to feed your family. That's a subsistence farm. If you tried to grow for profit, there wasn't enough nutrients in the soil to be able to make that happen. The religious leaders, the priests, the preachers held all the power. Democracy wasn't even really a thing in the beginning. Now it will develop into democracy, but at first, they feared the church leaders feared democracy because they were afraid of the masses of the people, that the people would wield too much power. Yeah, very strict, very pious, very religious. It says here, you got religion and politics, the whole idea of democracy and how they intertwine. Many people were exiled from Massachusetts Bay because of their church. They criticized the church or the government. They would kick them out. They were, as I said, very strict. Respect for authority inculcated very, very young. They told you right from the get-go. Here's a 1648 law. Any child of competent understanding would be put to death if they were to curse or smite, hit their natural father or mother, unless it can be sufficiently, unless it could be sufficiently verified that the parents have been very unchristianly negligent in the education of such children. So anyway, that's their beliefs. You can tell how strict they are. It says here, unthinking respect for authority is the greatest enemy of truth. Albert Einstein. So that we'll talk about that quote a little bit later. So obviously, if you're going to run your country like that, you're going to have your dissenters, people who went against the grain. One of them was a woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson believed in a concept called antinomianism. It's a belief that because of predestination, I don't have to listen to church law. Why do I have to listen to what preachers say? God has already determined whether I'm going to heaven or hell. And you can imagine how that went over with the preachers and those who wielded all the power. They wanted to get rid of her really, really quickly. And they did. They kicked her and her family. She had a bunch of kids, 15 kids or something like that. And they ended up moving out west and getting their entire family got killed by Native Americans. So Anne Hutchinson was a dissenter at Massachusetts Bay and her belief in antinomianism. Another one, a little bit more better outcome for him, a guy by the name of Roger Williams, who was a Puritan preacher, believed in freedom of religion. He believed in separation of church and state, and he believed that they should pay the Indians for the land. He felt like they stole the land from Native Americans. Well, you could again just imagine what the Puritan preachers thought about Roger Williams, and it's freedom of religion? No way. You had to be Puritan. You had to be saved. Separation of church and state? Nope. They wanted all their tax dollars to go to the Puritan church, which they did. Paying the Indians for the land? They had no respect for the Indians. So they didn't want to pay him for the land. So as you can imagine, again, they banished him. They kicked him out. Well, he ends up going and finding a piece of land. He brought some of his followers with him, and he started a new colony called Rhode Island. He came across Rhode Island, and he says, I want to start a colony here. So he paid the Indians for that land, and he started Rhode Island, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. A little bit more about Puritan politics. Theocratic governments, meaning that religion was dictating what happened with politics. Each Puritan town had its own church and town meeting, a form of government where all male church members made decisions about running of the town. Law mandated that religious devotion was enforced. You had to be strict and very pious and very religious. Anyone who practiced witchcraft or worship a god other than the one acknowledged by the Puritans was subject to death. And we'll see later on about the Salem witch trials that happened here in Massachusetts Bay. We'll be talking about that down the road. So anyways, Rhode Island was the colony that was started by Roger Williams. And sure enough, he based it on freedom of religion, even for Jews and Catholics, which in most colonies, they were forbidden from settling in most colonies. But Roger Williams said, we'll take Jews and Catholics and anybody else who wants to settle in Rhode Island. They had separation of church and state. You didn't have, when you paid your taxes, none of it went to any one of the churches. It was the most liberal of the English colonies. It's very similar to that of one that we talked about before, and that was North Carolina. I called it the Santa Cruz of the colonies last chapter. It was planted by dissenters and exiles, so Rhode Island became strongly individualistic and stubbornly independent because of Roger Williams. And of course, there it is there. So you can see where Massachusetts is, and then maybe you could even call this some of the first westward movement I mean, who would ever think that Rhode Island was west? But if you take the perspective of from Massachusetts and Boston, it surely is westward movement. So Rhode Island was settled. The other northern colony that was settled was called Connecticut. And Connecticut was started by a preacher who wasn't so much of a cast-off preacher, but he just wanted to do his own thing. His name was Thomas Hooker, and he settled along the Connecticut River Valley and established Hartford. You could see right in the middle there with the star as the capital. The Connecticut River Valley is interesting in that it's the only fertile area in the northern colonies because the river overflows its bounds, brings nutrients to the soil, and if you live along the Connecticut River, you could actually grow crops and even cash crops if you wanted to. But Connecticut crops weren't the biggest thing there. Their government that they created was called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It's a document that Thomas Hooker made everybody sign there, and it said that the only people that would be able to vote were white male property owners. He put in there a stipulation about you had to own property. So property ownership was what he felt important for democracy, and that if you own property, you would take the time to vote the right way, I guess you could say. So all three of these, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, were all settled by Puritans. And the Puritans' values in this country are strong. Let me go back a couple to the Puritans and what they brought to our country today. The Puritans had a strong work ethic in that you worked for 6 days, and then on the seventh day you rest. That was their philosophy. The only thing you could do on Sundays was go to church, and you could do nothing else. No recreation, no going out. It was a day of prayer, and then you worked sun up to sundown 6 days a week, and that was adhered to very, very strictly by the government authorities. So the Puritan work ethic that we have today in this country dates all the way back to this time, 1630, when they settled. The Puritan model of education. The Puritans believed in education. They wanted their kids to be able to learn to read so they could read the Bible. So church, education being really, really important in Massachusetts Bay, so their kids could read the Bible, especially for men. Women would stay in school long enough to read, and then that was it. They'd be done with school. Men could continue on. So we'll be talking about some of the other things that the Massachusetts Bay and the Puritans brought. But, our desire to go against authority at times, comes from the dissension like the Anne Hutchinsons and Roger Williams of the world. So Massachusetts Bay, first strong organized group in American history. Right? You had Jamestown was all over the place. And then you had the Pilgrims that were there strictly for religious. And then 10 years later, you had Massachusetts Bay. So remember those: 1607 Jamestown, 1620 Pilgrims, and 1630 Massachusetts Bay Puritans. So timeline in your head becomes really, really important for this class. Do you have to memorize exact dates? No, but there's some big things that you have to know when the dates are, so you could help you keep things straight in your mind. All right, so back here, we talked about Rhode Island and we talked about Connecticut. And there's a sculpture of Thomas Hooker right there.